Test, test. Thanks to everybody for showing up early. We're going to give folks a few minutes to filter in. If you have questions that you want to ask in advance or you want to make sure we get to, feel free to go ahead and drop those into the Q&A button that should be appearing on your Zoom screen. Also, we're trying a new presentation tool today, so I know I look a little blurry on the edges, but if you have any troubles hearing me or seeing me or anything like that, please do drop the note. Or if I look backwards, please let me know, so I'll try to correct that. Well, we're ready to get started. If you've filed a FOIA request before and you're comfortable sharing that, would love to see folks drop what they've requested in the chat or any request ideas that they've had that they've been really proud of. Already seeing some great questions come in, so I appreciate that. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, I'm Michael Morrissey. I'm the co-founder and chief executive of MuckRock. We're a transparency nonprofit. We run a number of websites, MuckRock itself, FOIA Machine, Document Cloud, OTranscribe. But the one I'll be talking most about today is MuckRock, because we help file lots and lots of public records requests, 50,000 public records requests over the past few years. And we're going to be talking today about just sort of how do you kind of come up with FOIA request ideas and public records request ideas? What are the basics you need to know about these laws and how you can use these laws to better understand your government, better understand your community, and get answers to the questions that you have. So first off, I'm kind of curious, and again, folks can drop this in the chat, and I'd love to kind of hear your experiences. But what have you heard about public records and FOIA requests if you haven't filed a request yourself in the past? One of the things that we commonly hear is that public records are really slow. It's impossible to get anything interesting out of requests. One common thing we hear a lot is people concerned about their privacy or concerned about retaliation if they file a public records request. And so I'm kind of curious, sort of, particularly if you're new to FOIA, what have you kind of heard and sort of what are the questions you have? Maya shared it's a frustrating and slow process. It certainly can be, and I'm hopeful that the strategies we can talk through today can kind of help speed things up and make it work a little bit better for you. I think the first few requests I filed, I got all sort of duds, and it's really easy to kind of come into FOIA and kind of run into some bad experiences. That they take a long time, absolutely. We'll definitely talk today about some strategies for speeding up the process. And if folks have specific questions or instances they'd like to get to later on in the presentation, would love to try to help workshop solutions that folks have. Great. Thank you. Oh, and costly, yeah. FOIA requests. We every once in a while we'll see stories about bills for FOIA requests in the hundreds or thousands. One time we got a response back. We're just asking for contracts that an agency had with a specific company, and they wanted $200,000 just for a copy of contracts. Um, so great. So we'll come back to some of these ideas and some of these questions, but I really do appreciate everybody who's shared. Just a little bit of background about me. In our organization, I filed my first public records request in about 2006, and none of them went anywhere. I filed 3 public records requests with my local police department, and I got back nothing. And 2 of the times they didn't even respond to me, and the 3rd time they gave me some unrelated documents. So since then, I've kind of made it my mission to really understand this process and figure out how do we make public records work better for more people, and how do we find ways to encourage agencies to actually follow the laws. In 2010, I co-founded MuckRock. We're a nonprofit based in the Boston area, but we have people all around the country. Um, and we help a lot of other folks file requests. We work with reporters, we work with newsrooms, we also work with researchers, but also individual requesters. People are just kind of curious about what their government is up to, and they have questions that public records can answer. One of the things I love about public records and the Freedom of Information Act is that these laws are really built for everybody. In most cases, you don't even have to be a citizen of that state or a citizen of the United States to file a records request, because the idea is that government works for the people. And so this isn't something that you have to be a lawyer to take advantage of. You have to be a journalist. This is something that's really a law, that's such a wonderful democratic law in terms of sort of reminding government and reminding the people that the government is our employee. And what it does on our behalf. And so we have a right to understand and a responsibility to understand what that is. And I think that's just something that's really wonderful about public records, even amidst all the frustrating aspects of it. Um, we filed about 92,000 requests. We've helped release about 6.2 million pages of documents. And we've worked filing requests with 17,000 different agencies. So anything that can go wrong with an agency with a request, we've probably seen go wrong. We've gotten sued for filing requests. We've gotten sued for posting documents that we've gotten through public records requests. We've had agencies ghost us. We've had agencies threaten us. You know, but I think a lot of times, I think building these skills and kind of getting used to sort of regularly filing a request really does work effectively. And we've also filed requests in all 50 states and at the federal level. I think one thing that when you're first kind of coming into this, you got to kind of learn is that there's the Federal Freedom of Information Act, and then each state has its laws, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And just briefly showing you the site we built. We try to make it a good resource for requesters. We can help people file requests. We have a service for helping file requests, and we kind of track that for our users. But even if you're not using MuckRock directly, most of the requests that we help file are public and publicly viewable. If you want to keep it private, you can, but we encourage our users to share their requests. And because one of the things I found most challenging when I first got into public records was figuring out what you could even request. And so it's a really great resource to browse and kind of learn from. Today, this is kind of just the roadmap of where we're going to be going. We're going to be talking about what is FOIA in the first place, talking about what you can actually request. We're going to talk about writing the actual request. The first time I ever filed a public records request, I spent hours kind of agonizing over the language, and so I don't want anybody else going through that. Then we're going to talk about the follow through, and then we'll have time at the end to kind of do any run through questions, or if people want to workshop specific ideas. Please do be dropping those in the Q&A. I might not get to them until towards the end, just so that we can work through all the main material, but I do want to spend as much time kind of going through your questions and your request ideas as possible. So first off, what is a freedom of information request? I think this is something that is really fundamental, but a lot of times we don't kind of take a step back in terms of remembering what this is all about. One thing that I see a lot of people who kind of learn that, oh, you have the right to ask government for information, and they have to give it to you, and they start sending government agencies questions, or they'll start saying, they'll get really excited and start trying to take advantage of this law, but not quite understanding how it works. Or conversely, people are intimidated because it is a very bureaucratic process. And so sometimes it can seem more complicated than it actually is. So just kind of at a very basic FOIA, people kind of are very divided around how they pronounce it. I call it FOIA, obviously. Most Freedom of Information Act officers at the federal government, I know, seem to call it FOIA. They say an FOIA request. I'm just too much of a fast talker to go with that, but either one is correct, and I think most of the community will be fine with one. But it's a federal law allowing access to government records. Sometimes people use it as a catch-all term for sort of any transparency law. Sometimes in the international space, they call them right to know laws, which I like. It right to know. It seems a little more inviting to me than Freedom of Information Act. But then there's other terms depending on the jurisdiction, right? And so I think it's key to remember that the Freedom of Information Act is a specific federal law, and that sometimes you're going to be putting in requests under that, and sometimes you might use a different law. Generally speaking, these laws allow the public access to records, typically unless those records are specifically exempt. So the way that most public records laws work is that information by default is public, and the information has to, the agency, if they don't want to release something, they have to justify and cite why they are withholding that record. And that's really powerful. It's instead of saying, oh, you can have access to this, this, and this, it's essentially saying that by default, this is something that's paid for by the public. It's something that we agreed to the creation of as a public at some level. And they need to tell you why you don't have a right to it. But the key is it's access to records, right? So this generally does not allow you to ask more open-ended questions. And in some cases, agencies feel legally bound to not kind of discuss those documents, right? So sometimes you might get a report, or you might get a spreadsheet, for example, and all the columns are like column 1, column 2, or they might be weird acronyms. And you're like, hey, can you explain this spreadsheet and what this actually means? And agencies don't have a legal obligation necessarily to explain what those documents mean. This is also really important as a requester, because I think one of the reasons we kind of use that Jeopardy image is because you can ask anything you want, but you have to ask for it in the form of a document or data that exists. Now, you can get really creative around that, and creatively defining sort of what is a document, what is not a document, but you can't ask sort of how many people were arrested in my city over the last year. Instead, you have to sort of figure out, does that agency have a document that might answer the question I have? And in most cases, the answer will be yes, but it's kind of figuring out, how do you sort of take the questions that you have and turn them into sort of proper document requests. Now, there is an asterisk allows the public access to records, because there are some states that restrict who can file records requests. In a lot of cases, people who are incarcerated are forbidden from making requests. In other cases, you have to be a citizen of that state to file a records request. So in states like Tennessee, Virginia, Alabama, they require in-state residents only to file public records requests. With MuckRock, we've actually started hiring folks who work in those states so that they can be sort of proxy requesters to kind of get around those laws. But generally speaking, we found those to be really challenging laws for requesters, even if you are a resident, because all of a sudden the agency now feels like, hey, show me your driver's license if you want to see this report, even if you're in the state requesting that information. So we see these as sort of really negative laws that kind of add an extra hurdle to requesters that is really challenging to deal with. One of the other things we've seen, and this is only in one state, but Louisiana bars minors from filing public records requests, which I thought was a really weird restriction. So I'm wondering what happened there, that they can't trust people who are under 18 with government information. It's really a really bizarre law. Thanks again for everybody dropping in questions and in the chat. I'm going to occasionally check in on that, but keep those questions coming. And I want to come back to them when we get a chance. Um, just a little bit of history around the law, because I think that's really important to kind of understanding some of the challenges of the public records law. Uh, FOIA was passed on July 4th, 1966. So this is a law from the 60s. Lyndon B. Johnson signed it into law, but very unhappily, right? I think he really said, like, look, this is going to be annoying. This is going to make my job harder. This is going to make government's job harder. And he really was going back and forth on actually signing it at all, but he ultimately did. And I think we're all very lucky that this law did come into effect. In 1974, after Watergate, that's when the law actually sort of got some teeth to it. They also passed the Privacy Act at that point, which restricted the release of private information and sort of put in additional controls around how government can handle private information. And we'll talk a little bit about that later towards the end of the presentation. But it also sort of created more judicial sanctions and more enforcement measures for FOIA, right? So in the 60s, FOIA existed, you could get records, but it was nebulous. And there wasn't really a whole lot of mechanisms for forcing agencies to actually follow the laws. It was even worse then than it is now in terms of the right to sue and the right to litigate and force agencies to hand over documents. There are 9 major exemptions to the federal law, including a catch-all exemption, sort of B3, that allows other laws to exempt materials. And so we're going to do a quick quiz here. And I will admit that I actually had to look up the answer before this presentation, but we'll just take a few minutes. I've got 2 questions on this quiz. The first one is, I'm just kind of curious, have you filed public records requests before, and just getting a sense of how many records requests folks have filed. And then I'm curious if folks know how many B3 exemptions there are, right? So there are 9 federal exemptions. How many B3 exemptions are there? And that's a very arcane question. So I'm kind of curious how many folks are able to get that. While folks are answering that, I'm just going to kind of run through and see if there's questions in the chat that I can run through. What do you do when, somebody asked, what do you do when the information in answer to the request evidences that activity isn't legal? I mean, I think that's one of the great powers of FOIA is to be able to showcase when the government is violating the law. And there's been cases where we found, going through, government spending reports, going through government credit card reports, you find out that there's fraudulent activity going on. And I think being able to share that, there's been a number of cases, both with MuckRock and other organizations, where just filing a request led to change within policy, right? Where somebody said, hey, I want a copy of the most recent drinking water safety reports in schools. I might be getting the details a little bit wrong, but somebody just filed requests asking for sort of the mandated drinking water safety tests in schools. And the school realized, oh, we hadn't actually been doing these tests, and they started up that testing. And so just the act of asking these questions brought to light bad policy and violations of the law, and started leading to positive change. Great. So a lot of first-time filers, about a quarter of you have never filed a request, and then others have sort of started filing. I think my big goal is at the end of this presentation, I really do encourage people to sort of think of something basic that you're maybe interested in or curious about, not even necessarily anything complex, but just trying to come up with, as we're kind of going through this presentation, think of something that might be interesting for you to request from a local agency, and ask for that information. That's great. So grand reveal is how many B3 exemptions are there? And this is actually, there's 2 answers I'll accept. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, recently they do a study each year about how many different B3 exemptions various agencies cited. And over the last decade, there's been 256 different statutory exemptions. That means that in other laws that are not the FOIA law, it says this document can be withheld from release to the public. And this number just seems to keep growing and keep growing. Agencies find creative new excuses in other laws to sort of block release. So um, for everybody, for the two people who put between 101 and 500, you got it right. That's very good. If you're interested in learning more about that, the website where that's studied that just came out within the past week or so is down there. And also we're going to do a write up on this presentation later, and we'll include a link in that as well. Now, we talked about the federal law, but each state has its own laws. Now, generally speaking, some of them are older than the federal law, some of them are a little bit younger. But they're generally speaking, state public records laws are, for the most part, pretty similar to the federal law. There's difference in particulars, they have different sets of exemptions, but it's not like certain laws work radically different than other state laws. They have different deadlines, different appeal procedures, that sort of thing, but the basics are pretty fundamentally the same. What we found in general is that state and local public records laws are less helpful with fee categories and have a less sort of well-run appeals process. That's not always the case. For example, I kind of like Texas's appeals process, although other people disagree with me. Typically speaking, local requests are a lot faster than federal requests. I think when you hear the stories of having to wait years or even over a decade for records, that's usually at the federal level. Public records at the local level tends to be a lot quicker. And then at the local level, people, I mean, we talked about all those different federal B3 exemptions. We see some really crazy stuff at the local level where agencies, maybe they haven't done the training, they haven't done the research, and they just kind of make up random public records requests exemptions that is really frustrating. And here is former MuckRocker Jesse Gomez wearing our FOIA public record shirt. And one of the things I love about that is just all the weird different little acronyms for public records. So you can see GRAMA, which is Utah's, the General Records Access Management Act, OPRA, which is New Jersey's law, OPRL, which I forgot what state, I think that might be Illinois, and then FOIL, which is New York State's law, where I filed my first public records request was actually a FOIL request. So start of the process, that's a little bit of the basics of the law, and now it comes time to actually start researching and figuring out what to request. So how do you turn your ideas for information or the questions you have into actual requests you can file? One of the places I really recommend starting is just starting to think, what would a middle manager do? I think one of the things, if you're a journalist or maybe you're sort of a citizen activist, a lot of times we think of like problems out there that we're really interested in or questions we have that we want to find answers to. And those are really important things to kind of keep in mind. But I think when it comes to public records requests, one of the best things you can do is as you're thinking about those questions or as you're thinking about that problem, think if you worked in government, if you were in charge of whatever department or whatever program it is that you're interested in, what are the documents you would need to make that program run? Because a lot of times, again, you can't ask questions. So you have to figure out what are the documents, what are the data that's going to exist to kind of answer the questions that you have. So some examples of how you can put that into practice. Mandatory reporting, right? I think one thing that government is famous for is government bureaucracy. And a lot of times that's for really good reasons, right? You want government to kind of do the things that it's supposed to be doing. And in a lot of government programs, you don't want people getting too creative with how they're implemented because that can have serious repercussions. So part of that is just there's a lot of paperwork in government. There's paperwork when you go out as trying to get your car registered or something like that. But just think through, okay, if there's this program that I'm interested in, is the government going to have to spend money? Are they going to have to buy stuff to implement that program? Are they going to have to train staff to sort of administer this new program? Are they going to have to, a contract with a printing press to get new forms printed out. Um, Always be thinking about sort of the procedure and process that are kind of used to put these kinds of programs into work that you have questions about. Think about also pay really close attention to sort of public admissions. And I don't necessarily mean public admissions as like a politician going up and saying, oh, I did X or Y, but sort of taking note of when government sort of says, hey, this document exists. And sometimes that's really innocuous and you kind of got to develop a sense for sort of when people are indicating those things. But when like the mayor says, oh, I'm getting daily reports on issue X, or maybe the county health department says, oh, we've seen these great metrics, and so it's safe to reopen now. Well, they said, hey, we've seen these great metrics. That means those metrics exist, and that's something you can request. So always be thinking through sort of like, what are the signs that there's something out there that'll help answer the questions you have? And then also, one of the things is sort of government almost always has to work collaboratively on stuff, right? I think local government coordinates with the state government to kind of follow these procedures. State government, a lot of that money is coming from the federal government through federal grants programs, and these federal grant programs have all these sorts of reporting requirements. Um, how is information flowing, not just within the agency that you care about, but with other agencies and other institutions that they might care about? And so people had some questions. I saw in the chat earlier, people are asking about nonprofits, right? So this could be really helpful. Maybe you're interested in a non-governmental agency or an agency that is not subject to public records law. You can sort of think through, does that agency coordinate with other agencies that are subject to public records law? Does that nonprofit have to report annually to the Secretary of State about its activities? Here in Massachusetts, for example, nonprofits have to sort of report more information to our Secretary of State than they do the IRS about their operations. And so there's a lot of information in the state filings that aren't necessarily in the federal filings. One of the other great things about that is I think one of the key things to remember, government is not sort of like one unified lockstep entity, right? I think there's a lot of disagreement within agencies, within different bureaucracies. There's a lot of sort of petty infighting, where a lot of times agencies spend a lot more time kind of being annoyed with other people within government than they do thinking about public records requesters. And so if you can find ways to kind of play different agencies off of each other, a lot of times that'll be a really effective strategy for you as a requester. So maybe the police department and your local school system are having an argument around how something is being implemented. If you file requests for the same information, maybe emails back and forth between the two, you file that request with both agencies. One agency might provide you with stuff that the other agency doesn't. Some other resources for just kind of infiltrating the mind of a government agency, right? Because I think it's really tough if you haven't worked in government, or even if you have, to kind of think like a government. I'm sorry, some of this stuff got cut off at the bottom, but agencies' own websites. I think a lot of agencies are actually kind of, they're not great websites in a lot of cases, but they are improving. And one thing that more and more agencies are doing is posting frequently requested documents on their website. So here, for example, is the FBI's website. Here's the FBI's website, where they post lots and lots of sort of processed FBI files for release to the public. Other things to look on websites are sort of, what information are they collecting? What are the updates that they've put out, right? Anytime that there's a web form on a website, or if there's like a form that they ask businesses to fill out, or people like a complaint form, that's going into a database somewhere. That's going into a filing cabinet somewhere. And that's a record that you can request. And so as you're kind of going through these websites, keep an eye out for sort of when they're soliciting information, or when they're kind of releasing reports, and trying to think through, okay, what are some of the underlying documents that you could request from that? Agency records retention schedules and systems of records. Beach season is coming up at some point in the future. I always think that agency records retention schedules are a great thing to take while you've got a nice relaxing day. Um, each federal agency and each state has what's called a records retention schedule. Now, sometimes there's multiple records retention schedules. So different states might have one for big cities, one for small cities, one for state agencies. Sometimes there's just going to be one, but each of these documents, the records retention schedules, details how long that agency needs to hold on to various types of records. And that can be really helpful as a requester because now you know, oh, this agency has to hold on to these documents for 3 years. Maybe it's workplace complaints and they have to hold on to those for a certain amount of time. The other thing that's really helpful as a requester is you're starting to get a sense of sort of that language agency's internal language. And now you can say, instead of sort of guessing what that document might be called, you can say, hey, I want a copy of such and such a report. According to the state records retention schedule, you're supposed to hold on to it for 3 years. And the other thing that gives you as a requester is leverage, right? I think one of the things as a public records requester, it's you against the large bureaucracy. They have all the time and money and lawyers on their side that you probably don't have. And so figuring out where can you get points of leverage against the agency is a really important challenge. But by being able to kind of say, according to your records retention schedule, you're supposed to hold on to this document for 3 years. You're then kind of creating this sort of like legal reminder that if you say you don't have that document, um, then you're kind of admitting to violating the law. Um, I think one piece of advice a requester gave me was like always engineer your request so that if they give you the documents, it's interesting, but also if they reject that request, that's an interesting denial because sometimes the biggest stories are when an agency says, "Oh, we have no documents about X," or "We're going to refuse to hand out this very basic information," and kind of highlights how sort of opaque they are. Um, Another resource, and again, I am very biased about this one, but muckrock.com, right? Slash FOI, that'll take you to our FOIA request search page. From that page, you can just click browse all requests if you just want to browse all 90,000 requests, starting with one at a time. But you can also kind of go through that page and sort of search and sort of, if you're interested in particular topics, if you're interested in particular agencies, you can browse, filter requests, and so you can see like successful requests filed within your state or successful requests asking for information about schools, a whole variety of different ways to kind of go through and see what has worked for other requesters, right? I think the public records request community, I think one of the great things is that if somebody has a really great idea and they get some really interesting documents out of their community, that's a request that probably should be filed in a lot of other communities as well, because a lot of times when we find something going wrong one place, it's probably going wrong in other places. And so building off of each other's ideas, building off of each other's work is really, really important in terms of just filing good requests, right? Because I think if you can kind of build off what's worked for other people, that's very valuable. We also have agency pages that you can search through our site. If you're interested in a specific agency, you can see what have other people requested from that agency and get some ideas there. One of the other sites we run, Document Cloud. If you just go to documentcloud.org, there's a link sort of towards the bottom of that page if you're logged out that'll let you browse all documents. And just searching through Document Cloud. So Document Cloud is used by news organizations around the world to kind of post primary source documents. It's got 120 million pages of primary source materials. One of the things that's really helpful about that is if I'm interested in sort of schools' responses to COVID-19, I can do searches for that and find what kinds of documents have previously been released from other agencies. And that might give me some ideas to file requests with my local school district, or that might help me see like, oh, this agency's released this report a few years ago. Maybe they have an updated copy of that report I can request. Another great resource, FOIA Mapper. I'm just going to go through this briefly, but one of the things that they have is a database of agencies' information systems at the federal level. It's only a federal resource, but all these agencies have databases, right? I think the federal government is constantly collecting all sorts of really interesting information just to keep regulating things, just to keep tabs on things. That's everything from FAA accident databases and all sorts of really interesting things. But I think one of the things as a requester that I'm really excited about is sort of as agencies slowly catch up with sort of the digital transformation, they're going to be generating all sorts of really interesting databases that I, as a requester, can ask for. FOIA Mapper has a really great system at the federal level for understanding what these are, and you can then request those databases. But also be thinking about this at the local level, right? I think one of the things I always encourage people to do is bring their creativity to the FOIA process. At the local level, always be thinking through sort of what information is my community gathering that would be interesting to me. One of my favorite examples, I don't know if we have any arborists here today or people are really into trees. I know nothing about trees, but you can in a lot of communities, if your city has an arborist, that arborist might have a database of like city-owned trees and their health. And so I used to live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the city arborist had a database, and people were able to go in and see like, oh, all of our trees are dying. Like 10% of the trees died year after year for a couple of years. And so being able to request that database and then do interesting things with it. Somebody was able to visualize, make a map of all the trees and kind of tell you where the community was prettiest during different times of fall. So there's all sorts of really interesting databases out there that government's generating that very few people think to request. This is a site that we don't run, but I also recommend it. It's a great tool if you haven't checked it out. Google. So one of the things about Google search is, and I don't know, this might be a little small, so I'm just gonna grow this real quick. I can't, okay. One of the things you can do with Google search is sort of put in specific key terms, right? So here, for example, we have, maybe I'm interested in housing and I wanna figure out what are some great requests for housing information I can find. Type in housing, but don't just search all of Google for it. Search maybe only .gov sites. So you can type in site:.gov, and then most of government communication is in PowerPoints and PDFs. And so you can type file type :PPT, PPTX, and sort of find all these things that are kind of hidden on government agency websites that if you're just browsing the website, you might not ever find. And you can also do site: maybe just a specific agency that you're interested in, and start trying to look for sort of like, what are files they've released in the past? What are forms that they ask people to submit, and use those to get ideas for public records requests. Some other search terms that I found really effective: PPT, PPTX, XLS. Those are spreadsheet files, and then PDFs. And there's been a number of times where people have gotten really big stories using this technique. So a few years ago, we found out that the Marine Corps' intranet, their like internal website, non-classified, was accidentally exposed via Google, and we found some really interesting documents that way. A few years ago, Motherboard found out that sort of like an internal recruitment site telling people how to use Twitch to kind of recruit people to join the military, that had accidentally been posted, and I think they found that with a similar mechanism. So there's all sorts of things, ways to kind of see sort of what's already out there and kind of use that to kind of inform your requests going forward. So now that you've kind of gone through and sort of started brainstorming request ideas and started thinking through what are things you can actually request, it's time to actually write that request. One of the things that I always recommend is when possible, getting your request to be specific. The more specific and the more evidence you have that the document or the data that you're interested in exists, the harder it is for the agency to kind of wriggle out of getting it to you. And it's also going to make it easier for the agency to kind of quickly go out and find and retrieve that document. Things that I think requests should, generally speaking, include in them: cite the law. There have been a number of studies that have found that a legal citation saying, under the Freedom of Information Law, under the Public Records Law, those kinds of reminders that this is the law tend to speed up requests and tend to make agencies more responsive. Specific document requests, right? Don't include general questions. Now, sometimes one strategy that can be effective is saying, hi, I'm requesting a copy of A, B, and C. If it's easier for you to kind of provide answers to these questions, I'm happy, be willing to negotiate and sort of figure out what you actually care about as a requester. Sometimes you just want to know sort of how many people have gotten sick in a community. You maybe want to know, how many people were fined for something, and sometimes negotiating. But do remember that public records are for records requests, and you can. Well, I always try to say, if it's easier for you to provide this in some other way, and it gets satisfies what I need, I'm happy to work with you. But do try to include specific records requests. Including enough detail for the agency to locate that information. I think one thing that is really easy to forget is just how large and sort of scattered a lot of these agencies are, and how many different things that an agency is going to be juggling. In a lot of communities, maybe a town has one part-time employee, and that's like their town's entire administrative infrastructure, and so they have to handle so many different things. And I do have a lot of sympathy for people in that kind of role where they're kind of having to wear many different hats. Um, and so making sure that they understand what you're asking for and giving them enough information to actually locate that information is really helpful. And that's why I like sort of records retention schedules, going through their agency's website. Make sure you're using the language that they're used to. Who might have that document? Now, can be a tricky one. You don't want to overly limit requests. I think that's something a lot of times requesters are very worried about, is sort of like, oh, if I limit my request too much, they're going to sort of like, um, work to avoid that. But I think if you can kind of include hints like, for your assistance in kind of locating these records, I think these documents might be located in the office of so and so, or I think this employee might know where to look for these documents. Um, you know, you can, if you're really worried about that, you can include language, but please don't limit my request to just that person's office or something like that. Um, but anytime you can kind of help point them in the right direction. Because I think one of the things I found is that a lot of times agencies acting in good faith, maybe their information systems are not nearly where we would expect them to be in 2021. Um, but anytime you can help point them in the right direction, it's going to go. Usually, that's going to work in your favor. And then we talked about including references to the record made by the agency or news media. There's been a number of studies that have found that public records requests that include external links that help that agency get more context about what you're asking for tend to get responded to more quickly and tend to get more responsive documents than a request that don't include links. And that's just because agencies, a lot of times they get this request, they don't really have context for what you're asking about. They don't know the stories, but if they read a news article or they see, oh, this was in the mayor's press conference, now I know, oh, hey, mayor, what did you mean when you said I'm getting daily reports about the puppy crisis in our town? Then the mayor can be like, oh, that's what I was talking about, and that sort of thing. And so including sort of specific citations like that can go a long way. Other things that are good that can go into a good request, um, keeping it clearly defined. Um, I think again, you want to sort of like um, one of the things I kind of suggest is sort of imagine, it's sort of like a hypothetical genie that is kind of grants you your wish, but in the worst possible way. A lot of times, public records requests can be like that, where you, uh, and not necessarily maliciously, sometimes not. But I think trying to think through like avoid having the agency make judgment calls. I spend a lot of time talking with public records officers, and their number one complaint about requests is requests that ask for any and all documents about X. They hate those requests because that's a super broad search. Do you want them searching every file that the agency has ever made? It's not like your modern computer where they can just type in a search term and get all documents that mention that term across the agency. And so sort of think through, what is the search that you actually want that agency to do? Do you want them to search specific people's inbox? Do you want that search limited to just a set of dates? I always recommend, if you're asking for emails, include date parameters. Any times where it makes sense, include date parameters. A lot of agencies have been around for a long time, in some case hundreds of years. And so if you're interested in documents, sort of think through, what is the actual date time that you care about those records for. If it doesn't make sense, if you're asking for a specific document, it doesn't always make sense, but a lot of times it does. Explain your status. Most requests are filed by commercial requesters. They're filed by insurance companies. They're filed by hedge funds. They are filed by dog walkers. Dog walkers are a very big public records constituency because they ask for dog registration data so that they know uh, where they should be advertising their services. So if you are a journalist, if you are asking, or if you're an individual and you're just asking for personal curiosity rather than, for profit gain, I would say, explain sort of your status. You don't have to go into why you're asking for those records. Almost every law says that the agency can't demand an explanation for why you're asking for records. But if you can explain sort of, this is for a reporting purpose, this is for research, this is to help inform my community group about what's going on this issue we care about, a lot of agencies will be much more lenient and flexible on fees. Um, Citing how you know that document exists. Again, if you can include some information about how you know a document exists, it's going to go a long way towards helping you get access to those documents. It's going to be a lot harder for the agency to kind of wriggle out of responding. Being creative. I think one of the things I always encourage people to do is get creative in terms of thinking about the documents that might be interesting. And again, we talked earlier, my hope is that everybody kind of goes out of here and starts filing their first request. Um, uh, if you see like, hey, this agency is asking people to submit their ideas for a new community program, or you just have other interesting questions, or you notice something that's small but you're curious about, um, being creative and sort of filing requests, and also creative in how you're defining documents. Maybe one requester sort of got the idea a few years ago. I want a copy of the 5 oldest requests that agencies have received that they haven't completed yet, right? This is a creative way to kind of scope a request, and they were able to figure out what are the requests that agencies have been sitting on for years and years. And then keeping requests to one page whenever possible. Um, Apologies to all the attorneys on the meeting, but a lot of times we see requests that get filed by really wonderful nonprofit groups and advocacy organizations, but they'll file like a 7-page request that'll include a ton of legal citations. Um, again, um, the public records officers, mostly just trying to figure out what you're actually asking for. And so the simpler you can keep it, the more direct you can be, the better it's going to work out, including a ton of legalese, maybe in a few cases, citations where you have to remind an agency that's previously violated something or something like that can make sense. But generally speaking, people tend to go overboard rather than underboard when it comes to sort of legalese. Again, don't cite every possible law. A requester, a friend of mine, was really excited. They had this request template, and they thought this was sort of the be all end all request template. It included citations of the federal law, random different state laws, the Declaration of Independence. Just make sure that you're only including what actually needs to be in that request. Don't include extraneous arguments or too much background. I think a little bit of context can be really helpful on a request. And sometimes if the agency, maybe they'll have an idea to get you answer your questions with different documents. I've had a lot of times where FOIA officers will say, I think you're trying to get at this. We can't get access to that database for this reason, but I have this summary report that somebody generated for the mayor last week, or that somebody else requested, and I can get you later this afternoon. So go light on the context. Some context is good, but it's very easy to go overboard. And this is not the place to include accusations, right? I know a lot of people are asking earlier, like, what if I find a request that shows wrongdoing? Well, that's great. Don't say like, the city is violating my rights. That doesn't go in the request. A request is asking for information. It's not a place to kind of make accusations. And then don't forget that there's a human on the other side of the process, and a human that, if the agency is doing something wrong, if there is a federal agency that is violating the law or restricting human rights, or doing something terrible or it's probably not the public information officer who is doing the bad thing. A lot of times it is people five jobs removed from them. And so picking a fight, taking out your frustrations to the public information officer is not going to help you get those documents more quickly. Um, a lot of the PIOs, a lot of the FOIA officers we work with are very, very underfunded, and they're kind of caught between requesters who are really frustrated that the process doesn't work better, and agencies that don't make a priority of being transparent. And so it's having sympathy and empathy for the person who's processing your request goes a long way. It's the nice human thing to do. And it's also a lot of times going to be beneficial to you as a requester. If you work with that agency and they say, hey, maybe these documents would be helpful, or maybe this would be something I should flag that person. If you've been kind and helpful to them, they're way more likely to make those useful suggestions than if you've given them a hard time. And just FOIA is often a game of telephone. I was talking with somebody who's a longtime FOIA officer at the Department of Defense, now retired, and they said the average FOIA request went through about 12 different people at the Department of Defense. So if you have a long, complicated request and it's multiple pages and it's a long PDF, it's going to get to the bottom of people's inboxes. People are not going to prioritize it. Versus if you have a request that's very concrete, very accessible, and clear about what it wants, and somebody who understands technology will understand what you're asking for. Somebody who understands that domain, somebody who doesn't understand it either. Make sure that whatever person sees that request, they'll be able to kind of move that along and make sure it gets to the right next person on the train. Some other ways to kind of short circuit that game of telephone, being open to directly discussing. One of the questions we get a lot is this FOIA officer asked if they could talk on the phone about my request. Should I do that? Generally speaking, yes. I would be very careful and thoughtful about what you agree to. I found sheriff's departments and police departments love trying to talk you out of a request and giving you all sorts of reasons like, oh, you don't need to file this request. We'll release this data soon or something like that. Remember that a FOIA request give you rights. And so, make sure you're sort of, and if you need some time, don't be afraid of saying, hey, let me think about that. Um, and I always recommend if you do have a phone call with a PIO, that stands for Public Information Officer. Um, I always like to be the first person to follow up and say, hey, thank you so much for your time on your phone. As we discussed, A, B, and C, right? Because if you don't get that memorialized in writing, 2 months down the road, you've forgotten the details. I know I certainly forget the details at that point. And it's easy for the agency to kind of rewrite history or just memories to defer. So I think getting something in writing after that is always really helpful. Um, Keeping that request clear for various offices, various audiences, right? I think a lot of times the IT department and the public records officer they tend not to like each other, and so whichever kind of skill set that person has, you want to make sure that they get that request and know exactly what you're asking for and exactly what to do with it. So if you're asking for emails, I really recommend to almost think through like, okay, if I was sitting down in Microsoft Outlook, how would I get some person to kind of do the search that I'm asking them to do? Because a lot of times that's exactly what's going to be happening. They're going to be going through and doing these searches. They don't have some agencies are now investing in better search software and that sort of thing, but it's um, they still have to do a search. They have to come up with search terms and criteria. And the more you can kind of specify that and make sure that those are the criteria you care about, the more helpful it's going to be. Um, and then if you can point to ways like, again, hey, I think it might be in this office. This document was referenced in the footnote of this other document you previously released. Just giving them hints. That makes it harder for requests to kind of go off the rails. And sometimes really intentionally, there's been times where an agency said, hey, we want to discuss your request. We have thousands and thousands of pages. Like I was asking for something very minor. I'm confused. And they misinterpreted my request, or I worded my request poorly and they were doing a search for all this stuff that I didn't care about. They already had what I cared about. So just finding ways to kind of keep that communication alive will go a long way. Um, that's it. So that's uh, coming up with sort of a good letter is not about sort of a lot of legalese. You want to include the law. You want to just write something that's hopefully less than a page, and then you draft that request. Dear, to whom it may concern, uh, under the Freedom of Information Law of New York State, I'm requesting the following documents. Detail the documents. Um, you can reach me at XYZ if you want to provide some contact information. Um, And then, either if you're filing through MuckRock, we have a database of agency contacts, or look up the agency's information on their own website. One of the things that somebody told me at federal agencies, almost all, if you just scroll to the bottom of that page, you'll see FOIA, and it'll include contact information there at the bottom of the page. Feel free to call the agency and say, hey, I'm about to file a request. Sometimes they get a little wary if you call and do that, but just make sure you're sending it to the right place, and then file that request at that agency. And now once you file that first request, the 25% of you who haven't filed yet, now you're a requester. Now it comes to the second part, which is the follow through, right? Because now that you've gotten that request out there, it's time to start making sure that they actually respond to you. First thing I always recommend with agencies, and sometimes this can be really challenging, and sometimes agencies are not acting in good faith, but I really recommend assuming good faith, particularly on the part of the public records officer, the FOIA officer, right? Again, most people in government are trying to do the right thing. Most people out there are trying to do a job. They have different priorities than you. They have a different perspective on things in terms of sort of what they need to focus on, or how simple or complex your request is. A lot of government systems are from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and are not easy to work with and extract information from. And so talking through and asking folks, like, if something seems like way off, like, why is this costing thousands of dollars? Why is this going to take a month? Trying to get them on the phone and say, hey, can I talk through my request? One piece of language I love to use is like, I'd love to find a way to reduce my burden, this request burden on the agency's resources, right? Like, what can I do to kind of speed this up and save you work and save me time? And a lot of times agencies will be really open to that kind of conversation. Let them know when you expect a response. Now, a lot of times it does take, different states have different deadlines. If you want to know your state's deadlines, you can go to muckrock.com/place. We have guides to each state's laws, but sometimes if you just say, hey, I'd really appreciate a response by Friday, that helps them sort of figure out, okay, can we triage? Can we figure out if there's part of this request? If we can't make it by Friday, should we let that requester know? I also always recommend work to get an estimated completion date from that agency for their request. At the federal level, agencies are required to give you an estimated completion date. States defer on that, but once you get the agency to kind of commit to something in writing, that sort of sets some internal pressure on them actually delivering on that. And so even if they miss it, you'll probably get something quicker if you can get them to give you an estimated completion date. That just helps them prioritize it. Earlier, people were talking about sort of what do you do to kind of avoid the long waiting game, because the FOIA request process can take a long time. So one thing I recommend is just being conscious of sort of the complexity of your request and sort of the size of your request. If you're asking for emails, how many emails do you actually need to get the answers you want? One of the things at the federal level, almost every agency that receives a significant number of requests has different processing queues. So they'll have simple and a complex queue. Most of the time, these queues are set at 500 pages. So if you're asking for something that's under 500 pages, it'll be in the simple queue. If you're asking for something that's over 500 pages, it'll go into the complex processing queue. One thing you always want to look at when you're filing federal FOIA requests is make sure that your request is not in the complex processing queue. And if it is in the complex processing queue, if they say your acknowledgement letter, like, hi, we've assigned your request number ID 123, and we put it into the complex processing queue, do what you can. Go back to the agency. Hi, I'd like to talk through the scope of my request and see if I can get that in the simple queue. Because the complex queue means that if your request is for 501 pages, it's not going to get processed until all the other complex requests that came before it, some of which might be hundreds of thousands of pages, are processed. So something to be looking for. And again, setting deadlines with the agency and negotiating with them, regularly following up and kind of checking in. With MuckRock, we automatically follow up with agencies every 2 weeks at the local level unless they give us an estimated completion date, in which case we wait till the estimated completion date. So there's a variety of other strategies, but I think the key is just kind of at the federal level, looking for that complex queue and then trying to think through, okay, what can I do to maybe get the documents I'm asking for under 500? Sometimes that means splitting up requests. Yeah, a lot of times, if you try and split up like a big request into a bunch of smaller requests and you file them all at the same time, a federal agency will kind of consolidate them into one request anyway. So maybe it's file for document A and B on Monday, and then wait a week, file a request for C and D a week later, or if you're working with a colleague, kind of split it up like that. But try to figure out how to scope your request to avoid getting into the complex queue. Um, so finally, as documents start coming back, so at this point, hopefully you filed your request, you've worked with the agency. Um, you're starting to get documents back. One of the things I do always recommend is make sure you vet your documents, right? I think a lot of times it's easy to kind of get primary source documents, and this is primary source material, but just like any source, if you're a reporter, those documents have bias. Those documents have problems, and sometimes it's conscious bias. Maybe this document was slanted in a way. Maybe somebody was coached as they were putting together a report. Maybe this was a CYA move by some agency that didn't want to get into trouble. So just think about, how do those documents generated? Who put this together? If you're getting back data in particular, a lot of folks I know who work in government data don't want to release it, not because they don't like being transparent, but just because they know all of the problems that are with a certain database or an Excel spreadsheet. And they know that internally, so as they're using that data, they kind of compensate for that. But maybe it's got a bunch of zeros in a column. Maybe that means there were 0 emissions that day, or maybe it means Frank was out on parental leave, and so they just didn't have anybody to collect that data, and they didn't fill it out in a way that communicates that. Does this information tell the full story, and does this document include sensitive information that the agency didn't vet? This is one issue that um, we've run into a lot, and I think if a lot of times agencies will not be super careful about how they're redacting stuff. Now, that's usually a good problem to have, but I think sometimes we've had agencies include social security numbers when they've released agency information to us. They've released medical status of inmates, which is we certainly don't want medical information. That shouldn't be released to a requester unless you are the person involved. So just be mindful of that. One thing I would argue for, other people feel differently, but if you do get sensitive information from an agency, one thing I recommend doing is just following up with them and just saying, hey, just wanted to give you a heads up that you accidentally released some sensitive information. I'm gonna just destroy my copy of it or whatever, but just heads up for the future. A lot of times agencies will accidentally release some sensitive information. The requester will publicly kind of call them out for that. And then the agency will then start like printing out, photocopying, and hand sharpieing everything and start charging a lot more money for the release of stuff. So when agencies try to do the right thing, when they try to release things in a native electronic format, let them know when they mess up. But I think I'd rather see agencies try to release things in a usable format and learn from their mistakes, rather than see agencies kind of go into some of the worst practices out there. But if an agency doesn't give you the information that you are supposed to, appealing. Not each state has an appeals process, and this is one thing where things get really different between the federal level. Each agency has its own appeals office, and there's also other organizations you can reach out to, like the Office of Government Information Services, that can serve as a mediator. Each state has its own process. But in a lot of cases, there's ways to kind of push back on agency denials. And so if your state has an appeals process, or if you're filing at the federal level, I highly recommend starting to appeal things. And I know a lot of requesters will even file appeals when they get documents, just protesting certain redactions, or feeling like, hey, I don't think I actually got everything I asked for. I think you only gave me 75% of it. Some studies have found that 1/3 of appeals end up releasing more information, 1 out of 3. That's a really great ratio of just filing a letter. You don't need to be a lawyer to file an appeal. Again, this is just something that if you kind of go through the law, look at why they withheld information, or just if you can come up with sort of a plain language explanation for why you think that search wasn't complete, um, there's lots of opportunities to kind of research and kind of push back on that. Sometimes that might just be saying, hey, it doesn't make any sense that this agency won't have these records because X, Y, and Z. Can you please search again? And I've seen an appeal like that be really, really successful. Two resources I like, I mentioned our state guide, muckrock.com/place. We have sample appeals. If you scroll down to the bottom, you can kind of browse our sample appeal directory. Um, and then the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press has really great state by state guides written by lawyers that go into a lot of categories of records and what can be released. Um, Key considerations when filing appeals: make sure they cite valid exemptions, and sometimes they'll cite things that are legal-ish or legal principles, but that aren't actually public records exemptions, right? The law says that unless something is specifically exempted, uh, the agency is supposed to release that. And so an agency might say, oh, this material is copywritten. Um, this includes copyrighted material. Copyright is not an exemption to the public records law. It might limit what you can do when you get those public records, but it's not an exemption. So make sure they're actually citing exemptions. Agencies tend to kind of hear something or make something up, or so just make sure that they're citing something that's real. And you can, a lot of times I've seen agencies kind of include, oh, under exemption 4 of our state code, and exemption 4 says the opposite, or it says something completely unrelated. Just because part of a document is exempt doesn't mean all the document is exempt. uh, Again, I try to avoid magic language in FOIA. I think there's too much emphasis on sort of like what is the exact right language, when it usually matters a lot less than people make it out to be. But if you're looking for language to use, say, hey, I want all of the releasable and segregable information, right? So if you need to redact certain parts of a report, if you need to redact certain parts of a spreadsheet, go ahead and release that. But if I'm asking for a report and they say, oh, this is exempt because it contains proprietary information, redact the proprietary information, give me everything else. Um, Even if you don't know the law at all, if you spend 20 minutes researching it, then a lot of times you're going to know the law better than they do. So kind of going back to those resources from the RCFP, cite those laws, cite those. And one thing I love about the RCFP guide, a lot of great legal citations, right? I think agencies all of a sudden get a lot less confident about their interpretation if you throw some legal citations in there. And now don't abuse that. Don't do something where an agency is going to call your bluff. But feel free, like if you're reading something and like, wow, there's a court case that found the opposite, go ahead and cite that. And then so a lot of times FOIA is a weird law because there's a lot of gray area and discretion in it, right? A lot of times an exemption says an agency may withhold something, or an agency is told to do a balancing test of what's the public interest in disclosure versus the private interest in personal privacy. And they have to make weird balancing tests, right? That's pretty unusual when it comes to most of the laws we deal with on a day to day. There's no balancing test when it comes to like your car's registration or inspection. But sometimes if you kind of appeal a request, even if it is something that the agency technically could withhold, they might make a discretionary release on appeal. That happens a lot. When I filed an appeal, the appeal agency said, you know what, this request was decided right, but we also don't think there's any harm in this being released, so we're going to make that information public. Some other strategies, right? So whether or not there's an appeals process, think through if this agency won't give it to me, excuse me, directly, does another agency possibly have the same records? Would they release them to me? Maybe again, trying to play different agencies off of each other. Does this information exist in some other area? Have people been communicating about this data in a way that I might be able to get those communications? At the federal level, and I don't think there's too many states that have an analogous law, but If you're interested in sort of what the government has on you, you can file a Privacy Act request, right? And so a lot of times you'll see an acronym FOIA/PA. That PA stands for Privacy Act. So you have a right to all the information for the most part that the government has on you. Now there's exemptions to that. So if like the FBI is actively investigating you, that's not something you can get. But generally speaking, the government will give you more information about yourself, and you even have the right to correct if they have misinformation on you, which is something that I haven't seen a whole lot of people take advantage of. But if the information they have in a database is wrong about you, you have a right to push back on that and get that corrected. If anybody's interested in school, or you're in school in particular, there's the Family Educational Right to Privacy Act, which a lot of times is used at the state level to withhold documents from release, right? Schools love saying like, oh, if there's ever a scandal at a school where there's some allegations from them, the school will say, oh, we can't release that information, it's covered by FERPA. Um, but if you're a student at the school, you can request your own records from that school. And schools are supposed to hand over any sort of educational records to students directly. So maybe if you're a student reporter, if you're interested in sort of what's going on, and you can get a student to file a FERPA request and give you those documents, that can be a really another avenue for opening up records, right? And so I think if FOIA doesn't work, maybe there's another law you can take advantage of. And sometimes the same is the case where if a government, you can't, generally speaking, the governments will not release sort of like files that get into sensitive information about living persons. But what you can do is you can teach other people to file a public records request. You can get other people to request their own documents from an agency. Or you can get them to fill out, there's a privacy waiver form. And if you get somebody to fill out a privacy waiver form, you can file a request for their records, and then the government won't redact that information. So this ran a little bit longer, but I do want to spend more time. If people have to jump off, totally understand. If you're looking to kind of get advice and you have to jump off now, or if you're watching this later, we have a free FOIA Slack chat room. You can register at muckrock.com/Slack. People share FOIA stories, people get advice. It's a really great community, and we'd love to have you join us there. And it is not instant. So after you register, we usually process those requests within 24 hours. But so you won't instantly get an invite, but we'd love to see you there and talk through any requests you have soon. So I really appreciate everybody coming today, and I'm going to start running through questions. So if you want to stick around and hear more about those questions or ask those questions, please feel free to. And if you want to hop off, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful Sunshine Week. And if you are looking for something fun for Sunshine Week, we just launched the FOIA facelift, which runs any photo you want to give it through sort of like a FBI file style encoder. So it looks like something was poorly redacted. So that's just a little fun thing we did. So I'm going to get to questions now. And just kind of run through these. Feel free to drop them into the Q&A or the chat, and we'll go from there. So the first question is, are 501c3s, are nonprofit organizations subject to FOIA? Generally speaking, no. Although in a few states, I think Virginia and a few other states, there's a couple of exceptions to that exception, right? So by itself, a nonprofit organization is not subject to the federal law. But increasingly, states are saying if they're kind of operating as government entities, if they're using taxpayer money and carrying out a program, that part of their work that is paid for by taxpayers is subject to public records laws. And I think this is really important because we're seeing agencies, like a few years ago, a bunch of police departments in Massachusetts came together and created a nonprofit organization that was kind of their SWAT team, their multi-jurisdiction SWAT team, and they claimed that it wasn't a government agency, even though all of its money came from tax dollars and it was a law enforcement agency. So that is definitely an area where it's going to vary state to state, but increasingly, or especially around prisons and incarceration, we're seeing laws say that if that nonprofit is acting at behest of or as a pseudo government agency and it's using taxpayer dollars, and it is subject to public records law. If that doesn't apply, there's still opportunities. Think, when is it ever coordinate with government agencies? Is it communicating with government agencies? Does it have to sort of submit reports about its activity? So there's a lot of times there's whole universes of other documents, so that even if it's not directly subject to public records law, it might be subject in some other ways. Somebody asked, what do you do when the information and answer the request evidence is activity that isn't legal? And I think that's great. I think that's the goal, is getting that kind of information. I think what you do then is if you're I think maybe giving that information to a reporter, maybe sending that to an oversight body or an ethics commission, and I think figuring out sort of what are your goals as the person who requested that information. How would we get text messages that are sent during public meetings by board members? That's a great question. I think that's something that we've seen come up increasingly, is open meeting laws are closely related to open records laws, and the central idea is, if you have a right to sort of see how government decision makers are working on your behalf, and policymakers, they should be debating these policies and coming to these decisions in public. And so one thing we've seen is a lot of people file public records requests. And I think it can be very straightforward. How do we get text messages that are sent during public meetings? I request text messages sent to or from the following people during the last 3 board meetings, right? It's generally in most states, it's a violation of, if people are talking in sort of a private back channel during a public meeting, that's usually against open records laws, right? They need to be having those conversations in public. As somebody who now serves on a public body, I'm on the federal FOIA advisory committee. It is logistically challenging, but I think it's really important that we make sure that folks are really following the law when it comes to this stuff. So that's a great request. And if you kind of Google like city council members texting during meeting, you'll see a lot of examples of that. But I think that's a fairly straightforward request. Somebody asked, looking forward, what is the top promising trend regarding state or federal FOIA as it relates to precedent, resources, timeliness, and what is a negative trend? So I think promising trends is sort of more people care about this. We started MuckRock 10 years ago, and I talked about FOIA with a lot of folks, and a lot of folks gave me blank stares. I've been really excited to sort of see how many people sort of acknowledge how important these laws are, and I think in a really bipartisan way. I think a lot of people, no matter their political beliefs, really do understand and care about public records. And so that's been really good to see. And I think we're seeing, to the question that was asked earlier in terms of like, are nonprofits subject to public records law? I think some of the most egregious loopholes are getting a lot more consideration. And I think that's really important, because as and this trend's kind of reversing now, but with like prison privatization, for example, a lot of those private prisons, fought tooth and nail to not be subject to public records law. There's other areas like charter schools, right? In some states, charter schools are subject to public records law, in some states they're not. And so that's a really important issue, sort of, if we're going to continue to privatize government services, do we continue to have oversight of those services? Do we continue to have understanding of how those services are being carried out? And there's going to be very strong vested interests that say, oh, as we're privatizing the services, we don't want to do that extra work of public records law. Then you'll see a lot of times those privatized service providers saying, oh, that's so expensive, or that's not our problem, or that's key, right? If somebody's your boss, they get to inspect your work. That's pretty fundamental. And so if the public is the boss of these privatized services, I think that's a really key bit. And we're seeing a much more nuanced, more robust discussion around that now than we were even a few years ago. So that's been something that is both a challenge, continued privatization, but also something that I think is really, we've seen some great work being done, both in the states and then at the federal level. Somebody said, in the past, I've tried to request a copy of specific police records involved in the death of a family member. The police department responded with a fee schedule per page with no information about how many pages would be involved. Um, yeah, I'm very sorry to hear about that. So I think they asked, and so basically this police department said, we're going to charge you X per page, but we're not going to tell you how much the total cost is. You have a right to get the total cost before processing that request. Now, most of the time, agencies have a fairly limited per page fee. They should give you an estimate, and so I would say, can you give me an estimate? That would be my first step. One of the other things that most states give you the right to inspection, right? So if an agency wants to play games with you and say, oh, we're going to charge you 10 cents per page or something like that, look up your that state's right to inspection. And if you can go in or you can get somebody else to go in, you can take pictures. I've gone into agencies before and like, uh, and this was back when cell phone cameras were a lot worse, taking pictures of a lot of like government documents rather than, um, uh, paying those fees. And now I think a lot of phones, they have all these portable scanners, but I think there's some really great apps just you can use on your phone that work better than portable scanners. So I think do keep in mind you have the right to inspect records, and almost every place the right to inspect is free. Agencies can generally only charge when you ask for actual copies, and generally speaking, they can't charge if you go in and inspect those records. Um, so somebody asked about, can you give any insight into the right to request records in an accessible format? Going back to the earlier question of sort of promising trends, um, generally speaking, courts are now finding that public records law says that they need to give you to the record in sort of like whatever that native digital format is. I don't think there's been a comprehensive study, and if anybody's heard of a comprehensive study, I would be really, really interested in that in terms of sort of any updates in terms of where things stand. It's been a few years, but generally speaking, the courts are finding that agencies do have to hand over those documents um, in sort of a native electronic format if that's what they're generated in. The downside of that is that very few agencies actually follow those rulings. And so unless you're kind of willing to go to court, I think it can be challenging. One thing I do recommend doing is I always include that language in there. Agencies generally ignore that language. But I think particularly for sort of like databases or spreadsheets, um, just making it really clear that that is. Generally speaking, you do have that right. It's just really hard to get that right enforced. Um, Somebody asked, I have a video of two police officers reacting to a text at the exact same time, and the PD claims that they do not use text for work. I think this is another really important area, right? I think we've seen a lot of stories in the last few years about agencies um, kind of using disappearing messaging apps or just using personal cell phones and personal email addresses to kind of communicate. Um, I think as a requester, I think filing appeals, I think kind of coming up with whatever evidence you have that this is happening. But then also just kind of like looking for that evidence, right? Because I think a lot of times, I think, for a long time, people said, oh, once people start FOIAing emails, people are going to stop, bad people are going to stop putting stuff in emails, incriminating evidence in emails. People still put incriminating stuff in emails all the time. I think if you are, generally speaking, if you're the kind of person who's violating the laws in sloppy ways, you're going to get sloppy about it. And so I think um, look for opportunities to kind of you know uh, if do they own work phones, requesting a copy of any messages sent or received in the past 10 days on those work phones. Um, Getting a copy of agency policies, right? I think getting a copy of agency disciplinary reports. And so thinking about, okay, again, just putting on sort of that bureaucratic hat and sort of thinking through, okay, how do I go back and sort of like maybe I look for like Google Play or Apple App Store receipts sent to their work emails And because every time you download a new app to your phone using one of those stores, they'll be like, oh, this person installed Signal or installed Wicker or whatever else. Um, just be thinking about sort of like what is the metadata that can help you make your case, and filing sort of targeted requests for that metadata. But that's a really big issue that I think, how do we sort of keep an eye on sort of electronic communications is a really big area. Um, just kind of going through some of these other messages, and thank you so much for all these great questions. It's really appreciated. Right. Diane, I'd love to. I think I just got an email from you as well, and I'll try and follow up with that shortly. I think that's a complex one, but I think it's. Um, I would love to see if there's some pointers I can send on that one. Um, Somebody asked a great question. How can you be confident you have thoroughly checked the internet and make sure the FOIA response you are looking for is not already been posted? That's a great question. I think we kind of talked through some of those earlier search techniques. Um, and I think, but there's been times where I was about to sue an agency, denied my request. We were working with some lawyers to sue. I thought it was an absolutely unreasonable denial, and then our lawyer got back to me. He's like, Michael, I discovered that they posted the document you requested someplace else, and it was a really obscure part. So I think just do as much research as you can. I think those Google techniques will go a long way. There's also FOIA Online is sort of the federal government agency's site. It's not used by every agency, um, but I think that's a good place to kind of do some searches. Somebody asked, we are recording this. I will post this on MuckRock over the next a week or so as we get a chance. And then somebody just mentioned up uh, talking about nonprofits. Somebody mentioned GuideStar, which is a really great resource for 990s. There's also the ProPublica Nonprofit Explorer, which doesn't make you register to kind of get access to nonprofit information. It's another really great resource if you're interested in digging into nonprofits. I think GuideStar tends to get the 990s a little bit sooner, but that includes basic financial information, who are the managing folks of an organization, and some other details that can be really helpful. Great. So I didn't get a chance to get to every question, but we're at hour and a half, so I do want to wrap things up. But thank you so much for everybody who came today and stuck with us for so long. And I really appreciate your interest. Have a wonderful, wonderful transparency week. If you do file your first public records request after this, I'd love to kind of hear about it. So stop in the Slack and share that. And thank you again so much for your time. And I'd also love to hear sort of what you thought of this training, what other ways we can do to improve it, and if there's anything you found particularly useful. So great. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it, and have a great rest of the week.